poor young man cried in a tomb. The millionaire said, "This is my mother's grave. What is yours?" The headline had been torn from a yellowing page and folded into the back pocket of Elara's tote. It had nothing to do with her at first glance, an odd, sensational scrap from someone else's life, but she had kept it for reasons that felt accidental and necessary at once, like a pebble one slips into a shoe and forgets until it forces the foot to change its step. That afternoon, the scrap rubbed against her hip as she stood among rows of granite and grass, the sky a flat pewter that kept most sounds softened. Wind pushed leaves along the paths in miniature waves. A wind chime somewhere farther down the slope gave a single, thin voice and then went still. Elara had learned the cadence of the cemetery in the weeks that had followed Lily Grant's funeral. People acted differently beside graves, quieter and awkward in ways that made conversation a lamp too bright for small rooms. She had come to this plot often, not because she was kin, she wasn't, but because Lily Grant had once opened her kitchen door on a night that had felt like an edge, and a door held in someone else's hand had saved Elara and Maisie from the cold. On that first evening, Lily had said, "Stay." She had put out a blanket on the sofa and a thermos of tea, and offered steady eyes and a loaf from the pantry. She had offered no impossible promises, only sheltering minutes that became sheltering days. Elara never asked for the reason Lily did it. She never pressed on the how or the why. Lily's kindness arrived like rain, without explanation, and it changed the soil. When Lily died, Elara thought she had only lost a single kind woman. She did not yet know that she had inherited a small constellation of favors, a ledger written in quiet acts that other people could not see. The grave before which Elara stood that afternoon bore a simple marker: Lily Grant, beloved. A small bouquet of hand-tied wildflowers lay at the base, their stems damp from morning dew. A young man knelt at the headstone, his shoulders shuddering under a thrifted coat patched at the elbows. He looked like any of the street's forgotten edges, hair uncombed, hands that suggest labor and hunger. But there was a look that made Elara's throat close. Grief was wearing him down, not with spectacle, but as an honest, elemental weather. He had been there longer than she, and Elara delayed her approach, because grief demanded no instruction from newcomers. She waited with the wind lifting the hem of her coat and the scrap of headline pressing against her hip like a small, ridiculous talisman. A car had pulled up along the cemetery drive while she watched, long and dark, leaving an impression of modern wealth, smooth paint, chrome that swallowed light. A man stepped out. He was older, maybe late 50s, measured in his gait, a coat that didn't wrinkle, hair threaded with silver. He was not showy. His economy of movement suggested money that had never needed to announce itself. He carried a bouquet of cultivated roses wrapped in tissue paper. He moved toward the two of them with a hesitance that belonged to people who had practiced being on the brink of speech and learned how to hold it back. He paused first by the young man on the ground, watching the shoulders shake. Then he looked down at the name on the stone, and the way his mouth tightened made Elara think of family photographs pushed into frames, the sort that keep both a face and an absence at once. "This is my wife's grave," she heard someone say, and for a second she thought the voice belonged to the car that had come. The man with the roses did not speak as a stranger. Something in his tone was less a claim and more a presentation of a piece of himself that didn't require defense. The young man swallowed and, without looking up, said, "Mine's here too." For a breath, they all sat on their own edges of silence. Then the man in the coat, John Grant, the marker of his face, had an economy of fame that did not advertise itself, sat on the low stone beside the young man, and set his roses down, careful, like setting a small, fragile truth into place. His hands folded on his knees, as if to keep them from moving. Elara was close enough then to see the young man's face. He could not have been older than 25. There was a tenderness about him that made his age feel both lesser and more. Grief had ripened him too quickly. He looked up finally, eyes red-rimmed, and said, as if with sudden defiance against the empty air, "They said she saved me once. I came to say thank you." John Grant's voice, when he turned to the young man, was neither swift nor cold. "This is my wife's grave," he repeated, as if reminding the world of the shape that memory had taken on his life. "What is yours?" The young man blinked, and then, as if all the explanation in the world could be compressed into one small packet, answered, "She let me sleep on her couch. She warmed my hands. She said I could come back. I thought, if I could just stand here, it would be like saying it again, like giving back the thanks she gave me." The way he spoke, plain and without flourish, made the words catch in Elara's chest. It was the same language she knew, small mercies tended without comment, a kindness accepted with the awkward gratitude of someone learning to carry dignity again. The young man's name was Joseph. Elara would learn it later from the man at the bakery whose brother had met Joseph at a job assignment. Names arrived in town like birds, pieces of a flock that found perchings. John Grant listened to Joseph as if each sentence were a document he needed to read carefully. Once Joseph finished, John's expression changed. Not merely the softened face of a man who knew loss, but someone considering the weight of other hands holding the world together. "You stayed," John said finally, addressing Joseph with a curiosity that felt like a hand held slightly out. "You kept her company." "I kept Maisie safe while I slept on the couch," Joseph said, and his voice thinned with that extra weight where shame met pride. "I paid back what I could. I left when work came. I was afraid." He shrugged. "Afraid to come back, afraid to be more trouble." John's gaze flicked to the wildflowers at his wife's stone, and then to the dark bouquet he'd brought. "Lily used to say," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone, "that there's no such thing as being too much trouble. Trouble is often the shape of needing someone." Elara found her feet moving before she could think to stop them. She had not meant to insert herself into this. She had come to sit with the memory that had helped her steady her breath after nights in the car, after doors that wouldn't open. Yet the pull of two people speaking low and earnest beside a stone felt like a small legal tender of belonging. She approached and laid her hand on Lily's marker with the casual, reverent respect of someone who had learned the map of other people's grief by peering at it from the outside. John acknowledged her with a nod. "You knew Lily?" he asked. Elara exhaled. Saying the name aloud made the hours come back to her like a film strip. Lily's hands on a teapot, the smell of broken biscuits warming in the oven, the way Lily had folded Maisie's small jacket when she was frightened. She saved my daughter and me the night the car wouldn't start and the snow came in hard. She had a spare room and a spare kindness. She gave us shelter and tea and told us to stay. I came here because I wanted to say thank you again." John's eyes were slow to move, registering each word like a ledger clerk. He picked up his roses and arranged them again, then set them down with a quiet deliberateness. She had a way of finding people, he said. She'd say the house always seemed fuller with one more chair at the table. A small sound came from behind them. It was Maisie, 4 years old, cheeks flushed, a scarf wrapped twice around her neck like a present. She toddled between Elara's skirt and the stone, clutching a paper heart she had drawn in kindergarten. Her hair stuck out in a cowlick that made her look like a wind-swept sprite. When she reached the stone, she set her heart on top of the bouquet like an offering. John smiled then, the expression loosening something in his face that morning had kept taut. He crouched to Maisie's height, his posture careful and uncluttered, as a man learning to balance who he had been in private with who he needed to be in public. "Hello, Maisie," he said, and his voice came as if from a room lit by a lamp. She handed him her paper heart with the urgency of a small diplomat. "For Mrs. Lily," she said solemnly. "She saved us. She had warm milk. She liked daisies." "He'll make sure she gets it," John told her. And though he spoke the obvious, his eyes were wet with something that was not only memory, but gratitude. After that day, the cemetery became a quieter map for Elara. Not a place of one-time pilgrimage, but a small orbit to which their lives returned. John began coming more often, bringing flowers, and sometimes lingering on the bench, as if expecting to meet the living in the landscape that Lily's absence had made. He did not intrude on Elara's privacy, he offered gestures. Someone fixing the window frames of the community room, an envelope slipped to the food bank that served hot soup to those with no other options. His wealth, if he had any use for it beyond the security of comfort, walked into the town with a slow humility. Elara never quite allowed herself to use the word employed when describing the arrangement that followed. Work, she called it in her head, a name for the neat transactions that made a life plausible. John offered something steady, a position at the small foundation Lily had run, a role that asked for hands rather than diplomas, the kind of work that had a beginning and an end each day and made rent feel less like a cliff. It came with dignity multiple times over, a small paycheck, a key to a door, the knowledge that someone believed you could be entrusted. On her first day at the foundation, Elara wore a sweater she had mended twice and a pair of boots with the heel worn thin. Maisie stood at the kitchen doorway and bit her lip as if expecting a thunderclap. "Will they like you?" she whispered. Elara knelt and kissed Maisie's forehead. "They'll like you best," she said, "but they'll like me too, I promise." Inside the foundation, rooms smelled of coffee and lemon cleaner. Photos of Lily hung in frames, her face laughing in a garden, arms open in the act of welcoming. John watched Elara with that same guarded kindness he showed at the cemetery. Their first conversations were small: where to put the files, which forms to use, how to take the phone messages. Over weeks, the conversations deepened into a habit of mutual respect. John learned what Elara could do with a steady hand. She could mend a child's scraped knee, soothe an anxious volunteer with a cup of tea, sort donations by the tenderness of their utility. Maisie learned to run her small errands with the unself-conscious joy of a child who had found more rooms in the house to play in. She brought John drawings with the gravity of treaties. She insisted he sit for tea in the parlor that had been Lily's domain when they were at home. John accepted these offerings with the same careful gratitude he showed everyone who turned toward him, not expecting to be given anything in return. Not everyone in the town agreed with the arrangement. Weekends sometimes brought murmurs, snatches of conversation at the bakery, the lifted brow of a neighbor when Elara's tote bore groceries more frequently. He looked toward the garden as if the plants might answer for him. Lily said once that giving someone a place to stay was giving them a chance to be more than their worst night. "What if Celeste thinks?" Elara started. John's jaw tightened then, and for a moment, the man who was measured and soft faltered into something fiercer. "I know what Lily would have wanted," he said. "She would not have wanted grief to be a show. If you and Maisie are safe there, then that is a memory honored." It was a small, quiet struggle in the town thereafter. Celeste's letters increased in firmness. She visited sometimes and left without speaking, her shoulders a line of cold resolve. Rumors circulated, as they do. People leaned at counters and repeated fragments like laundry over the fence. Elara accepted visits from the woman at the bakery who brought over extra loaves. She accepted a second-hand blanket from a neighbor who had died and left it in her will. She accepted John's job with a careful humility that sometimes felt like a second set of clothes on a body reluctantly wearing hope. Maisie adjusted as children do. She took to the ceremony of setting out a cup for Mrs. Lily at tea time, and to arranging Maisie's drawings in what she called Mrs. Lily's special box. She learned to make someone feel loved with the force of a child whose love is large and immediate. One evening, she poured John a cup of tea and announced with solemnity that he must keep it because Mrs. Lily's cleanup helpers said so. John accepted the cup, and the three of them sat on the porch as dusk pulled its curtains across the sky. The trouble that would test them all arrived in the form of a small, secret late-night fight and a slip into a dark hour. It began with an envelope, an unsigned note tucked beneath Lily's framed photograph in the foundation office. It said, simply, "They have taken something that doesn't belong to them." The handwriting was firm, the paper rough. It felt less like a stone dropped into a lake. The ripple reached everywhere. Celeste assumed automatically that the note referred to Elara and Maisie. She arrived at the foundation that morning as if to perform an audit. "You will understand why," she began. Johns cut her off with a hand raised, not in dismissal, but in the desire to keep the peace of the room. "Let's not make these spaces into battlefields," he said. But his voice carried a thinness that worried Elara. The war of memory was often quieter than people expected. It worked through small gestures and old papers. Celeste's anger coiled around things that were not actually matters of ownership, but of how people allowed a life to continue. Elara went home that night and sat at the sink, her hands in soapy water, and thought of Lily's teapot and the careful way Lily had dried it with a towel that had a small embroidered daisy at its corner. The note had made something brittle of the air. She had always known herself to be a woman of small claims, taciturn and cautious, but when accusations gathered around her, old insecurities rose like steam. In the late hours, she found herself reaching for an old solution to a problem that was not hers to solve. The bottle tucked in the glove compartment of the car she had once used. 2 weeks of sleeping in a parking lot had taught her to keep sedatives near in case grief became a night she couldn't bear. She remembered that night as if in pieces. The engine that failed, the radio that had given up, the way snow came down like paper. For a moment, she thought of returning to the car because anonymity felt like a cloak. But the world had changed in small ways she now relied on. Maisie's face sleeping in her bed, the smell of kettle steam in the kitchen, the keys in her pocket that unlocked more than a door. They unlocked an expectation that someone would come looking for them. Joseph's quiet voice at the grave came back to her as if it had been a prayer. People kept company. She could not bear the image of Maisie waking to find her gone, small and suddenly unanchored. She swallowed the cold that had gathered at her throat and then reached for her phone, an old flip model with a cracked hinge, and dialed a number she had learned she could always make herself use, the shelter helpline, but would send someone to check. The voice on the other end promised a ride if she needed it. She told them no, forced a laugh, and hung up. When she went to bed, she left the bottle where it had been, but turned the cap the other way, as one turns a key in the wrong direction to confuse the memory of an easier exit. What saved her that night was small and human, a neighbor's light that stayed on late, a footfall at the porch. John had not expected to find the cottage door ajar when he drove home after a late meeting at the foundation. He was not looking to be the town hero. He had simply wanted some rest. When he saw the bottle on the kitchen counter and the kettle left half full, he felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with propriety. He found Elara in the bedroom doorway, breath shallow, hair a tang of sleep and worry. He did not make a show of rescuing. He sat on the edge of the bed and offered tea in a mug he kept for emergencies, the type of thing his life had taught him to do, practical and unadorned. He said little. "You don't have to be alone with it," he said, "not when there are people who would fold the corner of their day for you." She cried then, in real, unchecked ways, not like the cough of a small sob in public, but like a storm that had been held back. The cottage filled with the sound, and Maisie came down the stairs, rubbing her eyes, and pressed her face into Elara's sleeve. John sat there with a quiet steadiness that did not hold judgment. When Elara later remembered the moment, she would think of it as the hinge on which the rest of things turned. Not a dramatic shift, but the way a good cup of tea and an unassuming chair can change the angle of a rainy day. In the morning, Celeste came by, having been alerted by a neighbor some time later, and found them together on the porch, Elara with a blanket over her knees, Maisie with a book in her lap, John with a newspaper he read with the patience of someone learning to be useful without being invasive. Celeste's presence pierced the fragile, warm scene like a needle. She had the right to be furious. She had the right to protect memory. Her grief had its own terms. "I didn't know there was more to this," Celeste said. Her voice held the brittle edge of someone who feared being replaced in the ledger of memory. John stood slowly then. "This house was Lily's because of who she was," he said. "Keeping that memory alive doesn't mean we lock it in a box. It means we keep doing small acts the same way she did." Celeste's mouth quivered. What if keeping it alive is different than giving it up? John considered this as if receiving a math problem he hadn't expected. What Lily left was not a trophy, he said. It was a way of being. She left us her hands, and we've been using them. Are we to bury hands because someone says so? Words do not change humanity on command. They shape the air subtly, and the town kept watching to see if the change would hold. Celeste did not leave then with an answer. She persisted in preserving photographs and notes, but she also began, slowly, to accept the small evidences of life that continued to orbit Lily's memory. Maisie's drawings found a place on a shelf, and Celeste, in a rare and tender moment, admitted to John that she had kept a tin of Lily's loose tea in the back of a drawer and had now poured herself a cup, and found it warmer than she had expected. The arc bent toward the public the following spring. The foundation wanted to host a small children's fair in the park, and Elara volunteered to bake cookies. John insisted on providing materials, but more importantly, he insisted on doing things with consistency rather than spectacle. He showed up early, sleeves rolled, his hands not unfamiliar with work when work served a purpose larger than his image. Joseph came with a cart he had fixed for the event. Volunteers moved like a slow chorus, arranging colors and small games. The town watched as memory and future braided. A child with sugar on her chin laughed by a wind chime that had once swung outside Lily's porch. Celeste arrived late, and for a moment they both watched each other through the rumor-laden air. She carried with her a folded note and a reserved expression. She walked slowly through the fair, watching Elara hand a cookie to Maisie, watching John tie a balloon for a small neighbor. When she reached the children's table, she found herself smiling for no sound reason, and then sitting down beside Elara as if drawn by a cord that had been stretched tight for months and had finally found a note to harmonize on. "I'm sorry," she said, not as an admission of everything, but as an offering in the small currency of human apology. Elara blinked. For what? For not seeing how much Lily's life could hold, Celeste said. There was a warmth then on her face that confounded the old hard angles. She would have wanted the children to be noisy and sticky. They looked at each other like two women who had been standing on different sides of the same river. The apology did not erase the past. It simply allowed space for living to be an extension of memory rather than an erasure of it. If memory was a river, then the decision John had to make arrived one evening on the bus line, literally and simply. He had planned to spend a week visiting a foundation partner in another city, a trip that would leave the house and the cottage quiet and ask someone else to tend the small things. That morning, as he waited at the bus stop, Joseph approached, breath visible in the cold, and handed him an envelope. Inside was a letter, folded and written in a careful, almost shaky hand. A note from a mother at the shelter whose child had been given winter clothes, from a man who had been helped with a room for a night, from an old volunteer who said simply, "Keep doing this." Each note folded into the next like a chorus of small testimonies. Then Celeste came with a different urgency. She wanted the house kept as Lily had left it, to protect a sanctity she believed Lily deserved. She would not have wanted people to live in a house of mourning, she said. She deserved privacy. John felt the two demands like a ledger with uneven sums. Preservation against continuation. Memory against necessity. He stood at that bus stop with letters in his hand and the world spread in options before him. And he heard on the breeze the memory of Lily's laughter in the kitchen when someone accidentally spilled too much flour and they all laughed anyway. He remembered her insistence, her small, stubborn philosophy, that love was shown by making tea when someone was cold, by offering the spare room when someone was alone. He folded up the letters and walked back to the house, the roses in his car briefly crumpled by the day's movement. At the door, he met Elara on the porch. She looked at him with an answer already there in her eyes, the query of someone who had trusted and been trusted. He took a breath. "I'm not a man who likes to make speeches," he said, and his voice had the soft firmness it held when he needed to be honest. "But Lily gave so many small things to people. I think the right way to honor her is to keep doing them." Elara felt the weight of the choice as if it were a stone, and then as if it were a key. "So what will you do?" she asked. John's hand went to the ring he still wore, an old thing he sometimes admired by bending its light between his fingers. "I'm going to keep the foundation open," he said. "I'm going to keep Mrs. Lily's house open to small mercies. If honoring her means keeping everything untouched, then I must ask whether we would prefer memory to be a museum or a house. I choose a house. When word of his decision moved through the town, it met both relief and disquiet. Celeste did not agree, but she ceased to fight with the same intensity. Perhaps she recognized that memory needs both preserving and scattering, both glass and letting go. The culmination of things came in a way that was sudden but felt inevitable. A school play where Maisie had the lead role of a small bird that must learn to bring its song to others. John sat in the back, more than a fatherly figure. He was someone who had chosen to be present for the small moments. Celeste sat at the edge of her seat, her hands folded, and Elara clutched a program with the fierce, steady hope of a woman who had learned how to keep a life warm. When the play ended, the children spilled into the lobby like a burst of confetti. Maisie ran into Elara's arms with the enthusiasm of the child who had tasted belonging. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a paper heart with the careful lettering of someone who had learned to make things say forever. John knelt and took Maisie's small offering, and then, in a movement that felt both private and public, he set it on Lily's stone the next day at the cemetery. He chose to say nothing, but to plant the small paper heart beside the fresh bouquet, and then he turned to the young man who had first been there on that cold day, and to Celeste and to Elara, and spoke in a voice that hoped to be both simple and irrevocable. "This is my wife's grave," he said, and the words hung like a promise. She lived among people. She wouldn't want this place to be a place that forbade living. If you look at her life, you'll see it was always given to others. I choose to live that way. If that makes some people uncomfortable, I will stand with the discomfort. I will choose mercy. The cemetery heard it with that peculiar quiet that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something heard. Joseph, who had knelt there months ago with raw tears, stood and placed his hand briefly over John's shoulder, a small human touch that said what words could not. Celeste watched with the slow arrival of the thing she had feared, life encroaching on loss. Then she stepped forward and, with a gesture that surprised them all, placed a small pressed daisy she had kept from Lily's garden beside John's roses. Elara watched the exchange like someone learning new grammar, how to fit new words into an old sentence. When the small drama calmed into ordinary movement, she felt something in her chest relax, as if a string had finally been tied. The house became more than a stage for past sorrow. It became a place of future laughter. Months later, the cottage's porch light was a beacon in winter, a signal to anyone who needed a place to stand. Maisie learned to tie her own shoelaces and to set the table for 3 without being told. Joseph found steady work at the town warehouse and sometimes mended fences for the old men who could not bend as easily anymore. Celeste brought rumors of a different kind, invitations to neighbors' dinners, and an acceptance that memory could be both guarded and shared. On a spring evening when wind chimes made the garden sing, Elara placed a small cup of tea on the porch table, and John came with a plate of cookies Maisie had helped bake. They sat in that modest company with the easy silence of people who had reconfigured their lives around another's absence. The paper heart Maisie had left at the grave the day of the play was now tucked into a jar on the mantel, a relic and a bridge. "She would have liked this," John said suddenly, looking at the little family before him with a tenderness that did not need ceremony. She always said our work was not about grand gestures, but about showing up. Elara smiled, thinking of Lily's hands folding towels and the small thriftiness of her mercy. She taught us to leave doors open, she said. John's eyes went to the wind chime, which sounded as a small thing moved by a breeze. Sometimes doors need someone to walk through them, he said. I've learned to walk. Maisie climbed onto John's lap like a small reclamation of warmth. Celeste, who had come by with a pie and moments of awkward tenderness, stood near the window and watched the scene with something like approval, though she still kept the photographs she'd retrieved in their frames. The town took this not as a miracle, but as a succession of small, stubborn gentleness. A life of kindness continued. People went on with their days, but the town carried now an extra filament of care. When someone was cold, someone else came with an extra quilt. When a single mother needed a job to make rent, someone advised her, gave her references, helped her with a list of tasks. These acts were small and private, far less fitting for headlines than they were for the ledger of the heart. There would be no thunderous epiphany to end the story, only the slow, patient accumulation of living. Maisie learning to plant daisies in a patch that had once Lily's favorite. Elara saving the first paycheck with a practical joy. John learning that being rich in kind means letting your hands get dirty sometimes. Celeste would come to bake once in a while, a small, cautious truce that spoke of valleys crossed. On a late afternoon when the sky leaned toward gold, Elara walked with Joseph to the grave. She had a small sprig of lavender and Maisie's crayon drawing tucked into her palm. Joseph had a new coat that fit him without making him look smaller. They arranged their small offerings together, laying them gently as if they were the soft instruments of a quiet music. John watched from afar, his figure on the horizon a measured presence. When the ritual finished, Joseph straightened and wiped his cheeks with the back of his hand. "Thank you," he said, voice brief, to Elara, not for any single action, but for the way the town had rearranged itself to hold someone who had once been invisible. Elara thought of the headline folded in her bag, its jagged sentence a strange prologue to the long story she had come to live. The poor young man had cried in a tomb, yes, and a millionaire had spoken. But what came after was not the simplicity of the line. It was the complicated, earnest labor of people choosing to be the sort of community that Lily had taught with her teapot and spare blanket. It was the continuous work of grace, which showed up in small acceptances and the courage to keep living. They walked back to the cottage as the sun lowered into a warm bruise. Maisie ran ahead and then turned back to shout a new discovery. The wind chime had been repaired, and its voice now carried through the dusk like a small bell of welcome. As they reached the porch, John stopped for a moment and said in a voice that carried across the yard, "This is my wife's grave." Then, as if to lend the world an instruction, "And this is how we keep her, by opening our doors and our hands." Elara looked at him and saw a man who had chosen, not with spectacle, but with daily fidelity. The choice had been his, to live toward the living in honor of the dead. It had not simplified grief. It had threaded the sorrow into a fabric that could be worn without breaking. Later, when the house was quiet and the children asleep, Elara found the scrap of headline again and smoothed it with her thumb. The words that had once felt like a stranger's sentence now read like a fragment of a larger story. She folded it carefully and placed it into the jar with the paper heart. Outside, the wind chime sang once more, a small, clear sound that seemed to say, in its own fragile way, that memory and mercy could coexist if people were brave enough to keep choosing one another. If anyone asked what had changed, she'd tell them what she now believed, in a way that was not a sermon. Kindness, she would say, is something you do with your hands.
It is the house you leave open for strangers until they are not strangers anymore. The world did not rearrange itself overnight, but in small corners, at tea tables, in foundation meeting rooms, in children's classrooms, it learned to name kindness as courage, to accept help with fewer apologies, to keep the door open. And in the quiet place where grief lived, it found the small breathing room to begin again. If you felt moved by this story, please consider subscribing for more gentle tales of ordinary grace, and share it with someone who might need a quiet reminder that small acts can change a life.
Thank you for listening. The days after that quiet confession threaded themselves into ordinary patterns. Rain came in a steady, consoling way one week. Frost painted the hedges another. The kitchen at the cottage became a place where small economies of care were counted in loaves and churns of soup. Elara rose early to sweep the porch, Maisie trailing with a small broom, and John would appear at the end of the lane with a basket of pears he had traded from the old orchard. They greeted one another as people who had learned how to live with sorrow, without theater, with attention. Joseph surprised them all by teaching himself to carry a ladder. He fixed the gutters on houses whose owners were too frightened to climb, and he tied knots with a neat, practical pride that made Elara laugh. He kept the little lavender sprig pressed between the pages of a notebook, where he also drew plans for a shelf or a garden bed. His hands were steady now in a way they had not been before. Steadiness, the town discovered, was sometimes the most eloquent form of thanks. Celeste became a frequent, not constant presence. Her visits were careful. She would arrive with an offering of rolls or a pie, stand behind the doorway for a moment as if measuring whether she was welcome, and then come in when Elara met her halfway. Over time, the pauses shortened. Celeste and Elara learned how to stand in the same room without begging for stories or explanations. They learned how to speak in the small language of household life, what was needed at the market, whose cat had kittens, whether the rain might ruin the radish seedlings. The truce between them was most visible in the kitchen, where Celeste corrected Elara's tendency to oversalt with a conspiratory tap on the spoon, and Elara, in turn, let Celeste have the last slice of bread without protest. At the school, Mrs. Rook took to telling the children the story of Lily in a way that was less a sermon and more a map. She did not dramatize the tears or the money or the headline. She told them about a woman who kept biscuits in her cupboard for the unexpected, and who lent a shawl without waiting for gratitude. Maisie listened with an alertness that had the sharpness of a child who has learned not to take comfort for granted. She began to draw hands, many hands, touching one another, a sky of small clasped palms that the teacher pinned on the bulletin board. There were plainly practical tests, a winter with old pipes that burst in one night, a widow who could not pay for the stove repair, a man who arrived from far off, carrying a suitcase and a cough. The town handled them the way it now handled grief, without fanfare, by arranging for temporary rooms, by organizing someone to stay while the widow's hearth was mended, by leaving a kettle boiling on the stove for the new man until he found work. They watched, in these small emergencies, how habit had altered them. Invitations were not announced with trumpets. Instead, they arrived quietly. Someone knocking, someone offering a bed for a week, someone taking a child for an afternoon so a young mother could rest. John kept the grave tended, as if tending a garden that blessed both the living and the absent. Sometimes he read aloud the letters he had written and never sent.
stilted, simple things that sounded like promises. Maisie would sit beside him, kicking her shoes into the grass, and he would tell a story about the teapot, not about its being famous or its value, but about the way Lily had insisted on pouring the last cup for the one who had none. Those stories were not private relics, they were instructions, repeated until they became second nature. There were moments, of course, when the old selfishness surfed back into view. A benefactor's package arrived for a family in need, and somewhere it became a currency for gossip. Why them and not us? A neighbor, tired from months of labor, snapped at a child's mischief. The town discovered, as any body of humans must, that grace is not a habitat you buy and move into. It is a muscle you have to keep working. Disagreements were hashed out at the doorway, over chipped mugs, in the awkward, resigned honesty of people who realized they would still be living together tomorrow. The ledger of the heart, the collection of small, private acts, continued to grow. When a bakery down the lane closed, the women organized a rota to deliver bread to those whose pensions were thin. When a storm felled the old willow by the stream, a team of men and women came with saws and laughter and rebuilt the little bridge children used to cross. When Celeste's mother fell ill in a town 2 valleys away, the town arranged a rota for her bakery so she could be gone without fearing her ovens would cool and customers would be left empty-handed. News, when it arrived in the form of letters and the visiting postman. There were some curious glances over the hedge when strangers came to the cottage asking questions about Lily, as if the story still had a gravity that could pull reporters like flotsam toward the shore. Elara met them with a gentle inconvenience. She answered where she must and refused where she must. The world kept naming her now as the woman who was part of the story, but she preferred, every time, to be the one who makes soup or the one who mends sleeves. It was a deliberate shrinking from spectacle, not shame, but a refusal to let grief become an exhibit. Maisie grew in fits and starts. She learned to ride a bicycle 2 summers after the teapot had been placed on the mantel. A rusty second-hand bike with a bell that refused to ring at first and then let out a small, delighted chime when she pedaled hard enough. She filled the cottage with drawings of birds and cups and hands. Sometimes, at dusk, she would sit on the window ledge and press her forehead against the glass, and Elara would join her, and they would watch the light fold itself along the hedgerow. On those evenings, words were few and sufficient. "Look," Maisie would say, and Elara would reply, "Yes." There was an unspoken covenant between certain people in the town. They would not let the headline become the ledger. They would refuse both the temptation to reduce Lily into a neat moral and the temptation to forget her, because remembering hurt. This balance was precarious and practiced. At the market, a woman who had once been ashamed to ask for help lifted her chin when Elara handed over a bag of potatoes. The exchange was held like a ritual of dignity. At the church, the pastors spoke once a month, not of miracles that cleaned up the world in a morning, but of responsibilities that uncluttered it slowly. As the year edged toward another season, the community's small acts did not resolve into some tidy conclusion. They thickened instead into a life that had room for both sorrow and delight. The repaired wind chime sang through many evenings. Children learned the names of plants and the names of neighbors. People married quietly in the town hall, and others buried old grievances like leaves in compost, knowing they would feed new growth. On a morning when the lane smelled of rain and wet stone, Elara found John sitting on the low wall by the grave, his hands folded like a pair of tattered gloves. He was waiting, she realized, for no one and everyone at once. She sat beside him without announcing herself. For a long while they watched the sky, the way clouds gathered like slow travelers deciding whether to stop. I used to think keeping her here was about remembering, John said at last, not looking at her. But perhaps it's more about what remembering does to us. Elara smiled, a small, tired thing that had managed lately to carry both grief and something like hope. It makes us keep the doors open, she answered. It teaches us how to keep living toward the living. John turned to her then, and for a moment the world narrowed to the space between them. "Will you come in for tea?" he asked. "There are pears." She took his hand, warm and strong. "I will," she said. They rose together, the two of them, carrying the quiet of the morning back toward the cottage, where Maisie would surely be drawing, where Celeste might be folding a cloth, where life, in its small, sustained persistence, would find them ready.